Origins of Modern Liberalism, Woodrow Wilson, Lecture 1. In the previous two series of lectures, we've talked about the intellectual and philosophical origins of progressivism. Remember, the sort of overarching theme of this part of the course is that contemporary American politics and the functioning of the American government today is really the product of a hybrid of two sort of, in principle, incompatible political visions: the principles of the American founding, rooted in equal natural rights and limited government and separation of powers, a more modern, progressive, or liberal view of government, which has a different understanding of human nature, of ethics, and the purpose and proper structure of government. So we talked about Rousseau and Hegel, then we got to America with Charles Merriam and his account of the sort of progressive intellectual critique of the founding and the alternative. Now we get to kind of the preeminent president of the progressive era, Woodrow Wilson, elected in 1912, as president from 1913 to 1920. And he was, before he was president of the United States, he was in fact governor of New Jersey. And before that, he was a political scientist, and he was also the president of Princeton, I believe. So he was, for a few decades, a political scientist before he became an active politician. And as I said previously, Theodore Roosevelt was a prominent progressive president before Wilson. And as we can see, or as I'll point out, it is actually Theodore Roosevelt who in some ways provided some inspiration for Woodrow Wilson regarding how to exercise the office of the presidency. But nonetheless, many of Wilson's sort of theories about government, his vision of the government of the U.S., dates back to his time in the late 1800s as a political scientist. Wilson was, throughout his career, critical of the founding principles. You know, he wasn't a complete critic of the founding, and he thought that Washington and Jefferson and the founders managed to accomplish something quite great in their time, but he also believed that the founding principles needed to be updated. And in this, he agreed with Charles Merriam. He was really a fan of, or a proponent of, the parliamentary style of government that you found in Great Britain. One of the things that you all might know is that, unlike in the United States, in Great Britain, you do not have a separation of powers. Instead, you have what's usually called a fusion of powers, which is to say that in Britain, the heads of the executive branch, so to speak, are all members of parliament. So the prime minister, who is the chief executive in Great Britain, is also an elected member of parliament. And so in parliamentary democracy, the executive is usually made up of the leaders of whichever party has a majority in the parliament, that is to say, in the legislature. So the executive is really a kind of committee made up of members of the legislature. So you don't have separation of powers. What that means, among other things, for example, is that in a parliamentary system, you don't have things like gridlock, where things don't get done because the executive and the legislature can't agree. The executive basically runs the legislature in a parliamentary democracy. And if there's a circumstance where the prime minister cannot get the parliament to go along with his or her plans, and that usually signals that there's a problem, and they call new elections in order to form a new majority. So you don't get gridlock. And Wilson thought that was a preferable mode of governing. He thought that the United States was really kind of hampered by the separation of powers, that made government function in sort of too clunky a way, without unity of vision and without requisite energy. And beyond that, he was also a critic of the limited character of American government. So you can see that he's basically, it's very similar to what Charles Merriam was talking about in the readings that we did for the last series of lectures. You might remember that Merriam said the old view of government with the protection theory was too limited. It saw the purpose of government as simply preventing people from inflicting harm on one another. And although that's important, the government has a positive role to play in promoting a broader vision of the general welfare. Right. So for the progressives, it's not the protection theory, it's the general welfare theory, a more expansive view. And Wilson completely agreed with that. And he also agreed with what Miriam had to say about how when you have a more ambitious vision of what government should be doing, the old vision of separation of powers and checks and balances, legislative, executive, and judicial, and all of that, becomes too clunky of a way to do things. And really the proper way of understanding the division of governmental powers is into politics and administration. The political process is there in order for public opinion to be formulated about what the nation's goals, what the nation's priorities are. That's the job of politics. Once those broad goals or principles have been established through political competition, then really the achievement of those goals should largely be handed over to specially trained civil servants and other experts to try to find the most efficient way to achieve those goals. And Wilson definitely agreed with that. And in fact, he was the author of one of the early influential essays in political science about the need for the professionalization of administration of government in America. He wrote it in the 1880s when he was a relatively young scholar. It's called The Study of Administration. You can still find it online. So he was a big proponent of a professional civil service. And he really thought that the government in his time, really the late 1800s and the early 20th century had become dysfunctional, that it had become responsive primarily to the interests of corrupt party leaders and selfish leaders of big business. And so he thought that there needed to be a fundamental reform in the way that government operated in order to overcome those problems. And he thought, and here he was partly kind of following an example set by Theodore Roosevelt. He believed that one of the keys to reforming the American political system was for the president to take a more dynamic role as being a national leader. That might not sound like a very big point to us now, because nowadays, frankly, most Americans do expect the president to be a kind of national leader. But you also have to remember that for a long period of time, that was oftentimes not the case. And this is something Wilson wrote a book on American government that contained within it a very well-known, within political science, a very well-known chapter on the presidency and his discussion of the limits and the potentialities of the office of the president. But many of you might know, if you think back to, I don't know, grade school or high school, if you were like me, in your school, there was you would end up in a classroom where there was a poster that had a picture of all the presidents that have been. And, probably as a kid, you looked at it and you recognized Washington, you'd recognize probably Jefferson or Adams, definitely Lincoln, right? There are certain presidents you might recognize. But then when you look at a lot of the 1800s, you kind of sort of look at those pictures and you just say to yourself, who are all those guys with beards? I've never heard of these people. Who's Chester A. Arthur? What did he do? Right? You have this period of what's sometimes referred to as the no-name presidents. That's why there are lots of presidents, and there's not a single thing that most Americans could name about what that president did. And one of the main reasons for that is because throughout much of our nation's history, and especially the 19th century, a lot of times it was really Congress and not the president that was in the driver's seat. This was partly because the U.S. Throughout much of the 19th century was not in need of a very vigorous foreign policy or a very large army or navy, because the U.S. had these two sort of wonderful fortifications that we call the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And those two oceans protected us from a lot of the rest of the world. So there was the Southern Hemisphere, which we had been actively involved in throughout, quite a bit of American history. But by and large, all of the big powers over in Europe that, we had, fairly marginal dealings with them. Presidents oftentimes are in the driver's seat when there's a foreign policy or when there's war, basically, or some kind of foreign crisis. Think about Abraham Lincoln, right, in the Civil War. But nonetheless, outside of that, in the 19th century, when things were relatively peaceful, Congress was really the place where a lot of the big decisions were made. And of course, a lot of politics happened at the local and the state level, and the federal government wasn't even really involved that much. So what this meant was that the office of the presidency, oftentimes, really the president was just kind of there to make sure that the laws were executed, and it wasn't really a huge position. And this is why Wilson, for example, says you have this interesting phenomenon in American politics where on the one hand, you have a handful of presidents that everybody has heard of, right? And who have left a very remarkable legacy. Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, especially those four, in Wilson's time. And then there are all these other ones that didn't necessarily do that much. And he said what this means is that oftentimes it's much easier to talk about presidents than it is to talk about the office of the presidency. That there's something kind of undefined about the office of the presidency, because on the one hand, it can lead to, these great leaders like Jackson, Washington, Lincoln. And on the other hand, it can be occupied by these no names like Chester A. Arthur. So, it's somewhat vague in its potential. And so one of the things that Wilson thought was that in the modern era, reform, to really bring about reform, you're going to have to mobilize public opinion. You're going to have to get the American public to demand things of their government, to demand reforms of the government. And he didn't think that would always work through Congress. One of the reasons why is because he thought Congress was controlled by these sort of selfish and corrupt political parties that weren't interested in reform. And also because, one of the features of American government is that when you think about Congress, even though Congress makes laws for the entire nation, no particular member of Congress actually represents America, right? The House is made up of 435 people, and each of those 435 people represents a distinct group, a district somewhere within a state. And then you have senators, but every senator represents a particular state. And so for progressives such as Wilson, what he thought is that this made Congress kind of parochial. It made members of Congress overly concerned with what was popular in their particular constituency. And then when they would get together as a body, as Congress to legislate, it was just a bunch of people with a lot of local interests, sort of wheeling and dealing and making lots of deals and helping each other out. But nobody was really taking the view of the good of the nation as a whole into account, because there's nobody in government that is accountable to the nation as a whole, except the president. And this is an argument that goes all the way back at least to Andrew Jackson. This idea that the president occupies a unique position in the American political system because he's the only one that's elected by the whole people, as opposed to representing particular states. And so Wilson really thought that the president was in a position to become a dynamic national leader, right? And to try to mobilize public opinion, since, as you know from studying the Constitution, presidents can't make laws, right? Presidents, they campaign nowadays. They talk about all these policies that they support, all these changes that they want to make. And anybody who's, even superficially studied the Constitution will listen to these presidential campaign speeches and say, okay, but you are the chief executive. You don't actually have the power to do any of this, right? If Congress doesn't want to do it, you can't do it, right? Like, hey, President Trump, how's that wall coming along, right? Because he can't build the wall. Congress has got to do it, because Congress is the one that taxes. Congress is the one that spends. Congress is the one that legislates. So the way Wilson thought, the way that the president can be an actual leader is by mobilizing public opinion. The idea being the president will give speeches, the president will try to mold public opinion, and then the public will demand of their congressional representatives that they get certain reforms. So the president kind of leads Congress indirectly by creating public sentiment. And Wilson saw this as a good possibility for the president, especially because, to a certain extent, that's what Theodore Roosevelt did. Theodore Roosevelt tried to be a very vigorous national leader when he was president in the 1900s, and that oftentimes involved appealing directly to the American people. He even did things, he recorded campaign speeches and put them out as vinyl records. I think they were vinyl at that time. I don't know. They might have been wax. But at any rate, he actually recorded things and put them out to try to affect public opinion. So Wilson thought our old system of government is too limited in its goals. It's too kind of fragmented in its structure. It really needs to be put under the guidance of a dynamic leader, and that's the president. So that was Wilson's view of the presidency. Now, as you might recall from one of the earlier lectures not that long ago, remember the progressive sort of revolution in American government had two major sources: a change in social conditions and a change in political philosophy. And so what I will do in the next lecture is talk about that change in conditions some more, and talk about how Wilson characterized changes in American society in the 19th century and the new demands that it placed on government. And then in the third lecture, I'll talk about his kind of account of how we need to think about government differently. So in the next lecture, I'll talk about Wilson's characterization of the changes in American socioeconomic conditions and the necessary reformist political response.